So thank you all very much for coming to hear us talk about our collection. It's a collection that we did collaboratively, and I must say that I did not class myself as a poet when I started this, so this is all very new for me. But the reason why we wanted to share it with you is because we kind of felt that we used a lot of constraints in different ways for the entire collection, and we thought it might be something that you might be interested in, and also to get some discussions going about, you know, whether or not you think it's constraints, whether you have questions about the processes we used, etc. Okay, so like I said, this is a collaborative collection between JP and myself, but also a collaborative collection in conversation with a lot of software or artificial intelligence as well. It's very visual, and it's been described as experimental. I don't think we started out thinking it was experimental, but that's possibly where it's ended up. The whole collection is really inspired by Turing's life and work, and I'll talk a little bit about how we researched that and you know what that inspired in us. And like I said earlier, it's out with Trick House Press on the 1st of December. So the constraints I kind of thought we'd talk about today, that I feel like we engage with in the collection. The first one is the collaboration itself. I had not worked on anything before with somebody else. So putting a collection together that was kind of in conversation with another person, and then having to work, you know, with another person in lots of different ways, we kind of felt that was a constraint in itself. And it kind of, we originally set out for the poems to be in dialogue with each other. So each poem has a response, and then that in turn has a response, etc., etc. When we put the collection together at the end, we didn't quite keep that order, but that's kind of how the collection came about. We were also very keen to use all the source material and that be a constraint as well. And we used a lot of that material to create the poems, and then used a lot of Turing's research ideas to explore how to generate poems using machines. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. So it's not just using machines to create poems, but it's using Turing's research to kind of create something related to that research, and then to have that embedded in some sort of artificial intelligence poem. What we didn't do as well, another constraint, is we did not mention Enigma anywhere in the collection, because we kind of felt like that had been territory that had already been explored by others, and we kind of wanted to concentrate on everything around that. Maybe JP, do you want to talk about how we started out?
Yeah, just a little bit of background on that. I mean, before we kind of get into the more technical bits. So I suppose another constraint here is the fact that actually we didn't really know each other particularly when we started this. And maybe I'm flexing the idea of constraint a little bit, but I think, you know, kind of doing a collaboration with someone that you sort of know and you're interested in their work, and you kind of see that you've perhaps got some things in common, but you've never actually kind of written anything together before, or at this point we hadn't even met. So I think we met for the first time probably around this time last year, and had lunch and had a chat about the various creative things we were working on. And Kinneson asked me about my collaboration that I'd done with more sort of standard poetry, if you like, which was with two other poets, and that was called Genderfucks, which came out sort of earlier this year. So we talked about the way of collaborating, and the fact that we'd done that all online and we hadn't met either at that point. So we felt that it was something that was possible, and we were interested in trying, you know, given the constraints. And then we saw a call out from a particular indie press that was specifically asking for this sort of conversation between sort of two poets. And although I think in some ways neither of us would perhaps consider ourselves to be poets in the traditional sense, this felt like it was sort of the inspiration to kind of think, well, let's try this, sort of see what happens. So we shared lots of ideas initially, you know, by email, kind of batting forth, you know, here's a whole load of topics that we could consider, and then found this sort of common interest that was partly Turing, but also very much sort of mathematics and AI, and the way, you know, his concept around, you know, thinking machines, and the way of which AI has developed, and how it's starting to be used in poetry and literature. And that sort of gave us something to work with. I think, you know, it's in the blurb, and you might have seen this. in terms of our different kind of backgrounds, if you like, to thinking about mathematics and computers. You know, Kinneson, you can add to this or correct me if I'm wrong. You know, you have this is your sort of area of expertise. You know, you have a sort of PhD in physics, and you're a mathematician. I'm basically dyscalculic, grew up in a home that didn't have a computer, went to a school that didn't have a computer, didn't touch my first computer until I was doing my master's in information science. So, you know, we were kind of coming from a completely different background in terms of our comfort around using this sort of technology and these sort of approaches in terms of constraints. But I think the important thing here is that once we got the idea, we then explored that primarily through the introduction, which you know, Kinneson wrote, or we kind of collaborated on together, and that really helped define the whole collection. We had a very sort of specific idea about what we wanted to do in terms of defining that concept, and then kind of explored what we could do with that concept, and basically used a whole range of techniques and constraints, which we'll kind of show you now, to sort of focus on Turing, his work, his later work, and his personal life and his sort of personal papers as well.
No, I would say, I mean, you know, from that introduction, it sounds like I just made JP do the thing that I was already comfortable with. But I think in terms of this, my comfort zone, I think poetry was outside my comfort zone. And I think that's kind of, you know, I really struggled to write poetry because I kind of had this idea of what it had to be. And I did not think it looked anything like what we ended up putting together. And I think what this collaboration kind of opened up for me was that it was actually okay to use my background or whatever. And in fact, I think it's true for all of my writing now, not just my poetry. And in fact, using my, you know, myself basically is actually going to make my work stronger. So yeah, the collaboration really helped open that up for me. So just about some of the logistics, you know, we said we did this, we only met once, and then we started, you know, just writing poems in dialogue, and we basically just opened up a Google Drive folder, shared it, and then that's how it kind of got going. And like I said before, there was this, you know, this call and response format to it originally, and then things kind of got you know, pulled apart a bit. And then when I spent a lot of time in the Turing archive here at Cambridge, then, you know, that kind of gave us lots of fresh ideas. And then we kind of both went away with that material and created new things, and then had to kind of see if anything was already in response to it, or if we wanted to write individual responses to it. I think one really good example of this is two poems from the collection. What you're seeing underneath the blackout is the first page of a typed up speech that Turing gave, I think on the BBC, I can't remember, about, I think, artificial intelligence. From the top of my head, I've actually forgotten. And, you know, our response to that was we both wanted to have a go at doing a blackout poem for that. And then we did two different blackout poems because we both saw very different things in it. And that was kind of how the source material then provided us a way to respond to each other and also respond to the material that's kind of there in the archive that you can go through. And that really is a really, you know, lovely nugget of getting to know Alan Turing. So that was one thing. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, JP.
No, not about that specifically. What I meant to add in the previous sort of background, in case it's of interest, is I suppose another constraint is that we basically had about 6-7 weeks to put this together, kind of back and forth entirely online. And I think that also really helped in a way, is that we sort of saw this call, and in the end, we, you know, that's not the publisher, that's not Trick House Press. So we ended up expanding on it beyond that initial kind of sort of submission requirements. But I think it kind of gave us that sort of momentum and energy to kind of work to that deadline. So again, doing it in a fairly intense fashion, I think probably generated different ideas and material than if you'd perhaps done it in a different way over a longer period of time.
Yeah. So, you know, like I said, we had a response to the archive sources. And then those archive sources really then helped us figure out the order of the collection. So I'm going to actually show you this is the contents page. And so, you know, I've already said that we avoided this enigma part of Turing's life, but, you know, we were concentrating on, you know, areas that he was very passionate about in terms of his research, which was obviously artificial intelligence, which is kind of that imitation game section. He was also, you know, doing a lot of work on morphogenesis, and that was happening after he'd been prosecuted and was being treated with chemicals. I think it's, JP, do you know, is it called chemical castration?
Yes, the chemical castration that was his sort of penalty, if you like, his you know, his what's the word, you know, when he was charged with indecent behavior, that was his sort of punishment, as it were, was either jail or chemical castration at home. So yeah.
And then the regulated by such laws is kind of the aftermath of that. You know, but you know, even after going through this horrific experience and having to, you know, be exposed to all these things, having to live with that day to day, he was still researching and doing, you know, being really quite productive during that time, despite everything going on. So we kind of use the chronology of the archive to influence the chronology of the ordering of the collaboration itself. So although all the poems were written in response to each other, we then kind of had to move that around a little bit because we wanted to think about these chunks of Turing's life and how, you know, how they all fit together. We also, I think, you know, because we come from such different backgrounds, like I said, the Turing archive really provided us with lots of inspiration to create poems, but we had very different interests in those sources. I mean, I was obviously very interested in the mathematics. There I sat down and went through a lot of his mathematical notes. So I don't think much of that turned into any poems, but that was kind of the thing that really sparked interest in me. And doing the mathematics was kind of how I got to know the part of Turing that I was interested in. I don't think that's the same for JP. Am I right in saying that, JP?
Well, I found it fascinating, but, you know, I think partly with my dyscalculia, with looking at numbers, it would just, yeah, I couldn't grasp it as much as I wanted to. I'm fascinated in the concepts, but the actual sort of maths behind it, yeah, just yeah, I was lost in that respect.
Which I think really comes out in our responses. So here's a really good example. This is actually a question and answer series that Turing gave in one of his, you know, most famous papers about artificial intelligence, and he comes up with these set of questions about, you know, a question that a human could ask a machine and the answer the machine would provide. And this is kind of the start of the germ of the idea for the Turing test. So he comes up, you know, please write me a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge, and the computer will say, count me out on this one, I could never write poetry. So it's kind of the computer's way of getting out of having to write a sonnet. Interestingly, I'll talk about GPT-3 in a moment, but, you know, artificial intelligence has come a long way since this. This is kind of how Turing saw a machine as responding. And so our responses to that, you can see here. I'll let JP talk about the one on the left-hand side, which is JP's response, but mine on the right-hand side is a conversation I had with Eliza. Now, Eliza was arguably the first algorithm or machine that passed the Turing test. So this is if a human is interacting with the machine but doesn't know they're interacting with the machine, is the human fooled into thinking it is or can the human tell the difference between whether it is a machine or a human? So Eliza was the first algorithm to pass this test. And so I had a conversation with Eliza, and then that kind of formed the poem. JP, do you want to talk about what you did for that one?
Yeah, so I sort of glitched it, basically. I'm not sure that I can add a great deal to that, but I guess perhaps also around that time, I was sort of experimenting perhaps more with visual poetry and using things like cut up generators and things, which I'll come on to the next slide, I think. And I suppose experimenting with the look on the page also with some of this text. So wanting to kind of keep the Turing's original conversation there, because I think, you know, it felt so iconic, not only because it was the example that he gave as to how we can sort of judge that machines have reached sort of a human level of understanding is whether they could write poetry or not. So I guess that the irony of that sort of appealed to me greatly, and I sort of just experimented with different ways to, I suppose, make that sort of visually more interesting. I don't think there was anything more intellectual to it than that, to be honest.
And yeah, but I think it's a good example of how, you know, we responded, or one of us has responded to the original source material, and then the other, I think that was actually JP that did that, and then I've responded to their response of the source material, if that makes sense, while also responding to the source material at the same time. Yeah, but you said you were going to talk about anagrams, cut ups, and blackouts, so go for it.
Yeah, so I suppose the constraints that I use, you know, being sort of mathematically inept, but, you know, completely fascinating. I mean, I remember that the second time we met and you were explaining to me some of the binary code and algorithms and things which we're going to go and discuss later, and I was like, this is amazing, but I don't understand it, but I like it, you know, and that's basically the approach that we took. We allowed each other, I suppose, complete freedom to sort of to have this response and to go with it and kind of come up with you know, whatever our creative response was. So a lot of what I used was kind of creative constraints around using blackout, erasure, and cut up. And I think possibly the first one that we generated after we'd written that introduction was a sort of blackout response to the introduction. So that's before we did the blackout on Turing's on a photograph of Turing's paper, you know, for that speech, and this sort of created an entirely new poem in itself, and yeah, kind of led from there. So we didn't want to do too much blackout, so there's only those two pieces, I think, in the entire book, but they're quite different in their form. Can you move on to the next one? So yeah, some of the sort of, I suppose, constraints that I created was using both kind of automated random generators that you could find online, like a sort of cut up and rub out generator. Cut up, of course, being something that William Burroughs and Brian Gyson sort of developed in the sort of 1950s. And it was something that I enjoyed playing with. So the example on the left is from the same paper, this sort of computing, machinery and intelligence, where Turing first talks about can machines think. And it was from a section where he was again providing an example of the things that he felt made us intrinsically human, that computers would not be able to achieve. And I'd kind of put this into a generator, and pretty much what came out was what I put onto the page. So that was one of the constraints that they used. I think the next slide is the other one I want to mention. And then I suppose, again, thinking visually about how to respond to some of this kind of quite heavy, you know, papers, at least for my sort of simple brain, was looking at his work around morphogenesis, which I found quite interesting because it was the work that he sort of focused on in that sort of latter part of his life, the period in which he himself was kind of going through that chemical castration, and obviously the impact on his own body. And you know, he did a lot of drawings of the process of morphogenesis, which Kinneson sort of was able to look at the originals in the archives, which was fantastic. So I kind of combined, I suppose, the visual representation of his drawings for morphogenesis with, again, creating my own kind of constraint from his work. So I would kind of go through one of the papers, select things at random from every single sentence. So I kind of gave myself that constraint, and then sort of paired them up in the order that they appeared, and then kind of created them, mapped them visually against his morphogenesis diagrams. I hope that makes sense. Have we got an example of one of these diagrams? Maybe later on. Yeah. So the other sort of constraints that I used, or techniques that I used, were chance, as I said. So other than using random generators, I kind of use my own generator. So in one of the papers for this sort of series of poems that sort of ended up giving us our title, Machinations, I searched for every single occurrence of the word machine, and then picked usually 2 words, sometimes a short phrase, or 3 or 4 at the most words, from the same sentence. Following after machine appears, I would then kind of pick a phrase from that sentence throughout the whole paper, no exclusions. So I didn't sort of allow myself the freedom of saying, oh, I don't like that, I won't use it, and created these sort of 3 separate pieces in the order that they appear. And I think what I found so fascinating for myself doing that is it really felt like it was telling us a lot more to the story. So obviously it wasn't just Turing talking technically about his findings and his research. I felt, and that was me obviously putting my thoughts onto it, that there's a lot of interesting phrases there that could be used to sort of relate to his own personal life and things that were going on at the time. And then the other sort of technique that I used, I suppose, is sort of collage or bricolage in poetry. So where you tend to use a lot of sources and different references, sometimes sort of different voices that are kind of, thrown all together. And I use this in one particular poem that appears towards the end, which was deliberately to focus more on not just his personal life, but I think references to some of his predecessors who'd also made great strides in mathematics and computing. So Charles Babbage, Ada Lovelace, and then you have references to things that were happening at the time, in their time, as well as Turing's. So yeah, we kind of allowed every technique that we were interested in doing. We didn't constrain ourselves in that respect, but or at least I didn't, because the mathematics was of course beyond me. Kinneson, pick up.
Yes,
unless
sorry.
Yeah.
I was just reading a poem. I think the responses that I had were very different, which I think is one of the things I really like about the collection. But a lot of the responses I had were trying to somehow incorporate some sort of software or machine learning. And so I showed you these 2 poems that we had done from the blackout previously. And so that was kind of, we had this 1 page, and then we both turned them into poems, using the blackout technique. But I wanted to also get the machine's response. So I used, for a lot of the poems in kind of the middle section of the collection, I used OpenAI's GPT-3. And so I would give GPT-3 the same source. So I would literally copy and paste all the same material that we had into that, and I would tell it to do exactly what we did. So I'll say, write a poem from this text, and it would. And then, that's what it came up with. And, I'm kind of interested in the question of whether or not whether or not I wrote it, or the computer wrote it, or, whether we both wrote it, or whether Turing wrote it, right? Because I think there's, actually I had to actually put in at the end of the collection a disclaimer saying that I, take all responsibility for anything I'm using that GPT-3 produced. So for those who don't know, by the way, GPT-3 is OpenAI, which is owned by Elon Musk's, basically artificial intelligence, which you can get free access to. And in fact, it's changed now to something else that was there, the old version that I was using last year. So it was interesting, this question of, who had responsibility for this poem now that I had I'd fed the computer something and it had produced something, just like we had been fed this source material and then we produced something. I don't have an answer to the question, but I'm just interested in the question. And then, as well as using GPT-3, I also wrote my own very basic algorithm that I wanted to be able to take visual or take images and have the machine produce a poem. And I started with a very simple image that I wanted to produce. And every time, so what I'm doing here is I'm taking an image and I'm converting it into binary. And then I'm assigning phonemes to, I think it's every 7 bits. So every 7 lots of zeros and ones, I assign a phoneme. And so when I start out, I actually think I wrote a poem, a blackout poem from an article. I can't remember what article it was, something about binary arithmetic. And I wrote a poem and I wanted that to produce the word all. And so from that kind of gave me the start of my binary digit phoneme dictionary. And then the next thing I did was, give it this image that says "such artificial flesh," which is again a response to one of JP's poems. And doing that, I then kind of ran the algorithm, and it came out with some words. You can see here it really likes the word flesh because that was already in the dictionary. And then there was some gaps. There was some, some 7 bits that hadn't been assigned yet. So then, as the poet, I was going through and saying, okay, so I can kind of maybe I can make that word say skin, for example, or whatever it happened to be. But once I put that into the dictionary, if I then go and make another image, that my dictionary is getting bigger and bigger, and I'm actually losing control, right? So, the more I use this algorithm, the bigger the dictionary is getting, and the less control I have over what gets produced. So that was kind of the basis of the algorithm that I was writing. I mean, it wasn't a complicated algorithm either, and I've actually got a link to the code. But then what I wanted to do, as I discussed earlier, was that I wanted to use Turing's research to create these images. So this image I just did back here, that was literally in response to something JP had written. Whereas this one is in response to Turing's paper on morphogenesis. And so here, this image here is actually something called a Turing pattern. And a Turing pattern is basically what Turing thought. He didn't call it a Turing pattern, it's what we've called since. It's a pattern that he thought, is found a lot in nature, or might be found a lot in nature. And he wanted to basically come up with a set of equations to predict why these patterns happen. So I took the paper, I took the equations, I implemented a solver to solve. So the equations are actually the reaction diffusion equations, if anyone's interested. I implemented a solver. Actually, I didn't implement anything. I stole somebody else's implementation of a solver, which is very much what you do in the world of computational physics. You just find somebody else's and change it a little bit. And then I ran it with a bunch of different parameters, and I got this image, which I thought was really beautiful. And then I converted that into the binary, and then put the binary through my phoneme dictionary. And then it kind of came up with this poem. Now, it didn't come up with this poem entirely. So, it just comes up with a string of phonemes, and then I can kind of figure out where I can start putting gaps. But of course, it starts putting together phonemes that I can't, sensibly separate. So it starts making up its own words. So I think for this poem, I still had a few words I could assign, but mostly I'd lost complete control of what was happening. So you've got words like ingreshings, gresh, none of these, these aren't words as far as I know, but the algorithm is making them up. And so as the poet, all I had really left, except for those few words I could put in there, was white space, right? How it looks on the page, moving things around. And I think that's where I was very much out of my comfort zone in terms of what I thought was poetry and what my poems ended up being in this collection, very much pushed by the fact that I had to respond to what the algorithm was doing in some meaningful way, in the most meaningful way I could think of. So that was the Turing patterns one. And then, oh, no, that's it. Okay, I actually have, well, the next slide is any questions, but I actually have a bit on my website. Can you all see that my website?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to share the link in a second, but I'm just going to show you what you can do. So that's the Turing patterns one there. So if you click on that, you can actually have a go at creating these patterns. So there's a stripes one and a spots one. I mean, the parameters, you can change them an infinite number of times, right? So we're just doing stripes and spots here, but they're seeded using a random number generator. So each one is completely unique. And then I also did a random walk. So you can see a random walk. And again, it's random. So each time you load it, it's completely unique. So this was kind of part of our desire in the collection, was to be able to show people how we did what we did, very much show your workings, which you kind of felt like that was part of sticking true to Alan Turing. So, these things I'm talking about that changes an image to a poem, you can see here, this was an image I took, well, this is the one I just showed you. You can see this is a very rough representation, but you can kind of see the patterns, how it turns into binary, and how it comes out of the phoneme dictionary. So yeah, so I'm going to show you the link so you can all have a play around with that if you want to. And in the meantime, I'd love to hear any questions you have. And JP, unless there's something else you'd like to share.
Yeah, and I just want to add a little bit more to that. And then there have been a few questions or comments in the chat, which I think some will be interesting just to follow up, and then people might have more questions. So yeah, and as Kinneson just said here, we always started right from the beginning documenting, if you like, our own processes, and that felt like it was important and part of the project, if you like. So it was a no-brainer really for us to, almost like the academic papers that we were reading of Turing's, to ensure that you know, everything is referenced. You know, we put QR codes into the book that would direct people, you know, when they're reading the physical copy, to these specific parts of the website, because aside from, I suppose, wanting to ensure that we were, you know, documenting our references and sources, that people kind of keep playing with it and kind of keep interacting with it, and I suppose exploring the ideas and that we've put in there, and hopefully kind of helps people generate their own sort of love of Turing, but also kind of, you know, pushing the boundaries of what is poetry, and what's the relationship with poetry and AI and computing sort of going into the future.